The bells sound first. Deep, resonant clangs that echo off the snow-covered peaks of the Austrian Alps, growing louder with each passing second. Then come the chains, dragging across cobblestone streets still decorated with twinkling Christmas lights and festive garlands. The villagers gather in the town square, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid December air, watching the tree line where the forest meets their cheerful hamlet. Children press against their parents. No one speaks, and then they emerge from the darkness. Towering figures, bent and twisted, covered in matted fur and animal hides. Their faces are not faces at all, but carved wooden masks depicting something caught between goat and demon, with twisted horns curling toward the heavens and tongues lolling from fanged mouths. The creatures move through the crowd with deliberate menace, their bells creating a cacophony that drowns out the gentle Christmas carols playing from shop windows. They carry birch switches, stained dark with use. Some drag screaming volunteers into the street. This is Krampus. This is tradition. This is Christmas in the Alps. But what if the terror you're witnessing isn't simply pageantry? What if these grotesque celebrations, these deliberate inversions of everything Christmas represents, aren't just folklore invented to frighten misbehaving children? What if Krampus, this horned punisher of the wicked, is rooted in something far older, far darker, and far more real than anyone dares to admit? Across 6 disturbing origins, we'll trace Krampus back through layers of history that blend ancient pagan rituals with medieval brutality, psychological trauma with unexplained disappearances that authorities still cannot explain. We'll explore connections that churches tried to sever and truths that were deliberately buried beneath centuries of sanitized Christmas cheer. By the time we're finished, those twinkling lights and wrapped presents will cast very different shadows. You'll never see Christmas the same way again. Deep in the Austrian Alps, where winter once meant death more often than survival, archaeologists uncovered something that changed our understanding of Krampus forever. Beneath layers of frozen earth at a site near Salzburg, they found evidence of ritual practices that predated Christianity by more than 1,000 years. Charred bones arranged in careful patterns. Stone altars stained with substances that analysis confirmed were blood offerings. And carved into the rock face above, weathered but unmistakable, the image of a horned figure towering over prostrate human forms. This was no children's story. This was terror, made manifest in stone. To understand where Krampus truly comes from, we must journey back to a time when the Alpine winter was not an inconvenience, but an existential threat. The Germanic and Celtic tribes who inhabited these mountains lived at the mercy of forces they could neither predict nor control. When the first snows fell, usually in late October or early November, entire communities faced a brutal arithmetic. Would their stored grain last until spring? Would the livestock survive? Would they? The mortality rates tell a story that numbers alone cannot capture. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout the Tyrol region suggests that in harsh winters, up to 30% of a village's population might not live to see the thaw. Children and the elderly went first, their bodies too fragile for the relentless cold. But even the strong, even the prepared, could find themselves facing starvation when an early frost destroyed the harvest, or an avalanche cut off access to stored supplies. In this context of genuine terror, the tribes developed beliefs that reflected their reality. They understood instinctively what modern psychology confirms, that humans need to make sense of chaos, to give form to formless dread. And so they populated their winter darkness with entities that embodied everything they feared. Horned spirits that prowled the frozen forests. Demons that punished those who failed to prepare, who broke taboos, who offended the natural order. The horned deity motif appears throughout pre-Christian Germanic and Celtic cultures with remarkable consistency. In archaeological sites across Austria, Bavaria, and Switzerland, researchers have found ritual masks dating back as far as the 6th century BCE. These were not decorative items. Analysis of residue and wear patterns indicates they were worn during ceremonies, strapped tightly to the face, creating a transformation that must have been as terrifying to witness as it was to undergo. The masks feature exaggerated horns, often from ibex or stags, animals that themselves held sacred significance in Alpine paganism. But why horns? The answer lies in the fundamental duality these ancient peoples perceived in nature. The stag represented both provider and threat. Its meat could sustain a family through weeks of winter, but the creature itself was powerful, dangerous, and otherworldly in its ability to survive conditions that killed humans. The horned god was nature personified, neither good nor evil, but utterly indifferent to human suffering. It demanded respect, sacrifice, and absolute obedience to the rhythms of the seasons. At excavation sites throughout the Austrian Alps, particularly in the regions around Innsbruck and Salzburg, archaeologists have mapped networks of ritual spaces that paint a disturbing picture of how these beliefs manifested in practice. Stone circles positioned at specific elevations, always just below the tree line, where winter winds howled with particular ferocity. Within these circles, the evidence becomes harder to dismiss as mere superstition. One site, discovered in 1998 near the village of Bad Gastein, contained the remains of at least 12 individuals, all young, all showing signs of ritualistic treatment before death. The bones bore cut marks consistent with ceremonial preparation. Around them, scattered in patterns that suggested deliberate placement, were birch branches, their significance we will return to shortly, and iron chains corroded by centuries in the frozen ground. The chains are particularly significant. Metalwork was precious in these early Alpine communities, requiring tremendous effort and resources to produce. That such valuable items were used in ritual contexts and then abandoned suggests the ceremonies held importance beyond mere theater. The chains served a dual purpose in the belief system. They bound the offerings, human or animal, preventing escape. But more symbolically, they represented the binding power of winter itself, the way the season chained communities to their settlements, made prisoners of people in their own homes. Birch rods complete this trinity of Krampus iconography, and their meaning is perhaps the most complex. The birch tree held special status in Germanic paganism as a symbol of both purification and punishment. Its supple branches were used to beat the bounds of property, to drive out evil spirits, and yes, to strike those who transgressed community rules. In the context of winter survival, where a single person's carelessness could doom an entire village, enforcement of social norms was not merely preferred, but necessary. The brutality of these practices becomes more comprehensible, if not forgivable, when we consider the archaeological evidence of what happened to Alpine communities that failed to maintain discipline. Excavations of settlements that were abandoned during the medieval warm period, when they could finally be properly accessed, revealed scenes of horror. Bodies stacked in storage rooms, showing signs of cannibalism. Evidence of violence within families as resources dwindled. The dissolution of social bonds under the pressure of starvation. The horned winter spirit, whether called Krampus or by earlier names now lost to history, served as enforcement mechanism for a social contract written in frost and fear. Tales told around winter fires about the creature that punished the lazy, the wasteful, the disobedient. These were not entertainment. They were survival instructions encoded in mythology. When Christianity spread through the Alpine regions, beginning in earnest around the 7th and 8th centuries, the Catholic Church encountered these deeply rooted beliefs with a mixture of horror and pragmatic recognition. The Church's initial response was unequivocal suppression. Papal documents from the period explicitly forbid the wearing of horned masks, the performance of winter demon rituals, and the continuation of what church authorities called pagan abominations. But suppression failed. The beliefs were too entrenched, too tied to the genuine terror of Alpine winters that continued regardless of religious conversion. A villager might accept baptism, might attend Mass, might even believe sincerely in Christian doctrine. But when winter came and the darkness pressed close, the old fears returned. The instinct to appease the forces of winter, to perform the rituals that had sustained ancestors for countless generations, proved stronger than ecclesiastical prohibition. So the Church adapted, demonstrating the remarkable flexibility that has allowed Catholicism to absorb and transform countless indigenous beliefs. If the horned winter demon could not be eliminated, it would be repurposed. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. The Church placed these pagan terrors in explicit service to Christian morality. Krampus became the servant of St. Nicholas, the the dark shadow to the saint's light, punishing not those who failed to store enough grain, but those who failed to obey Christian virtue. This transformation served multiple purposes for the church. It maintained social control by preserving the fear mechanism that enforced community discipline. It demonstrated the power of Christianity to command even demons. And perhaps most cleverly, it created a theological escape valve. The darkness, the terror, the violence that seemed incompatible with a loving God could be outsourced to this pagan remnant, now safely contained within Christian framework. The speed of this absorption varied across Alpine regions. In some areas, written records suggest the Christianization of Krampus occurred within a few generations of conversion. In others, particularly isolated mountain valleys, the hybrid form took centuries to fully develop. What remained consistent was the essential nature of the figure, horned, chained, carrying birch rods, and fundamentally terrifying. Modern Krampus celebrations, the Perchtenlauf runs that draw tourists to Alpine villages each December, are pale echoes of something far older and more desperate. When you see men in elaborate demon costumes running through snowy streets, shaking chains and mock-threatening children, you are witnessing the domesticated descendant of genuine religious terror. The chains they rattle once bound sacrifices on stone altars. The birch rods they carry once drew real blood from real backs. The horns they wear mimic the sacred masks of priests who believed, truly believed, that they were channeling forces that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The archaeological record continues to yield new evidence of these practices. As climate change causes alpine glaciers to retreat, they reveal what has been frozen for millennia. In 2013, a melting ice field in the Utstal Alps exposed a ritual site that radiocarbon dating placed in the early Iron Age. Among the artifacts recovered were chains, masks, and an arrangement of animal and human remains that suggested ceremonies of appalling complexity. The site's positioning, at an altitude that would have been nearly inaccessible during winter, raised questions researchers still debate. Did the rituals take place in summer as preparation for winter's trials? Or did the tribes make desperate pilgrimages to high places, even in the killing cold, believing that greater sacrifice would purchase greater protection? We will never know the names these ancient peoples gave their horned winter deity. Their language died with them, replaced by Latin, and then the Germanic dialects that evolved into modern German. But we know what they felt. We know the terror that gripped them when the sun began its autumn decline, when the first frost came earlier than expected, when the snow piled higher than memory could recall. We know because they carved it in stone, because they buried it with their dead, because they transformed it into a creature so powerful that even a triumphant global religion could not destroy it, but could only repaint it in new colors. Krampus is not merely folklore. It is fossilized fear, the preserved remains of genuine terror that once meant the difference between life and death. The horns, the chains, the birch rods, these are not random scary elements cobbled together for effect. They are the distilled symbols of humanity's struggle against winter's indifference, given form and name, so that we might believe we had some power over it, even if that power was only the ability to understand why we suffered. The Alpine winter of 1650 descended upon Bavaria with a silence that felt almost sacred. In the villages that clung to the mountainsides near Berchtesgaden, families prepared for the Christmas season with the same rituals their ancestors had practiced for generations. Children carved wooden toys, mothers baked Lebkuchen filled with honey and spices, and fathers brought evergreen boughs into their homes to ward off the darkness of the solstice. But that winter, something came down from the mountains that would transform the Krampus from a cautionary tale told by firesides into something the villagers would come to fear as a genuine and present danger. The first child to vanish was a girl named Margarete Hoffmann, 7 years old, who disappeared on the 5th of December, the eve of St. Nicholas Day. According to the parish records maintained by Father Johannes Eckhart at the Church of St. Andreas, Margarete had been playing in the courtyard of her family's farmhouse just before nightfall. Her mother, Anna Hoffmann, testified to the priest that she had stepped inside for no more than a few moments to fetch bread for supper. When she returned, the courtyard stood empty. Fresh snow had begun to fall, and in that pristine white canvas, Anna saw something that would haunt her testimony. The tracks leading away from the courtyard were not those of a child's boots alone. Beside Margarethi's small footprints ran prints of enormous size, clawed and deep, as if whatever made them carried tremendous weight despite moving through fresh powder. Father Eckhart recorded Anna's words in Latin, but the terror transcends translation. She described how the tracks led toward the forest edge, before vanishing entirely, as though the earth itself had swallowed both child and creature. The village organized search parties immediately. 40 men from Berchtesgaden and the surrounding hamlets combed the woods for 3 days, calling Margaretha's name until their voices grew hoarse in the frozen air. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign that the child had ever existed beyond those impossible footprints already disappearing beneath new snowfall. The winter passed in uneasy grief. Spring came, then summer, then autumn. The Hoffman family held a funeral mass without a body. Life in the village returned to its rhythms. Some whispered about the old stories, the demon that came at Christmas to punish wicked children, but these were dismissed by the more rational members of the community. Wolves, they said. Bears. Bandits from the mountain passes. Anything but the alternative. Then came the winter of 1651, and with it, 2 more disappearances. On December 4th, Klaus Zimmermann, age 9, vanished while bringing firewood from the family's woodshed. His father, a blacksmith named Georg, had sent the boy out at dusk. When Klaus did not return after a quarter hour, Georg went to investigate. The woodshed door stood open. Logs lay scattered across the ground. And there in the snow were those same impossible prints, clawed and massive, alongside the drag marks of something being pulled toward the tree line. Georg Zimmermann's testimony in the church records describes something else, something that sent ice through the veins of everyone who heard it. He claimed that as he stood there in the gathering darkness, he heard bells. Not church bells, or the gentle chimes that decorated sleighs, but harsh, clanking bells that seemed to come from deep within the forest, growing fainter and fainter until silence reclaimed the night. 3 days later, on December 7th, twin sisters from the Cole family disappeared together. Elsa and Greta, both 6 years old, had been walking home from their grandmother's house in the early evening. The path between the houses measured less than 200 paces, a journey the girls had made countless times. Their grandmother, Hild Kahl, testified that she watched them depart, watched them walk down the snowy lane, and then turned away to close her door against the cold. When the girls did not arrive home, both families retraced the route. In the middle of the path, they found both girls' cloaks lying in the snow, torn from their bodies with such force that the clasps remained fastened, the metal bent and broken. The village chronicle, maintained by the local magistrate, records what happened next in stark detail. The search party, now numbering nearly 70 men, discovered tracks that split from the path and climbed the mountainside. These prints showed the same clawed pattern, but this time, witnesses reported something more disturbing. The snow around the cloaks was disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle, but also showed curious circular depressions, as if something with a long, dragging tail had coiled around the area. The village of Berchtesgaden descended into something beyond grief that winter. Paranoia took root in the collective mind of the community. Windows that had previously stood open even in cold weather were now shuttered and barred. Parents forbade their children from going outside after dark. The Christmas markets, traditionally joyous affairs, took on a desperate quality as families tried to maintain normalcy while terror lurked at the edges of their consciousness. Church attendance swelled. Father Eckhart's records show he performed blessings on nearly every house in the village, sprinkling holy water on thresholds and doorposts while reciting prayers of protection. The magistrate, a man named Wilhelm Steiner, organized armed patrols to walk the village perimeter from dusk until dawn throughout December. His chronicle entries from this period reveal a man trying to maintain order through rational means, while privately harboring doubts about the nature of their adversary. In an entry dated December 15, 1651, Steiner wrote that one of his patrols reported seeing a figure at the forest edge. The description they provided matched no animal known to the region. They spoke of something that stood upright like a man, but was covered entirely in matted, dark fur. Its height exceeded 7 feet. From its head rose twisted horns that caught the moonlight. Most disturbing was its face, which witnesses said appeared almost human in structure, but was elongated, with a mouth too wide and filled with teeth that gleamed white against the darkness. The creature carried what appeared to be a large basket or cage on its back, and from its waist hung chains that dragged through the snow, producing that same harsh, clanking sound Georg Zimmermann had described. When the patrol raised their torches and called out, the figure retreated into the trees with impossible speed, moving through the deep snow as easily as a man might walk across summer grass. Winter passed into 1652 without further disappearances. The patrols continued through December, but no children vanished. Hope began to emerge that whatever had plagued them had moved on or been frightened away by their vigilance. Some families even started to believe that the previous incidents might have natural explanations after all, that fear and darkness had caused imaginations to conjure demons where only human evil existed. They were wrong. December of 1652 brought the final and most horrific chapter of the Berchtesgaden disappearances. On the night of December 5th, 2 children vanished simultaneously from opposite ends of the village. Johann Schmidt, aged 8, was taken from his family's barn where he had gone to check on their livestock. Across the village, 10-year-old Sophia Brenner disappeared from her own bedroom. Her window was found open, despite her father's certainty that he had latched it securely before the family retired for the night. The room showed signs of a violent struggle. Blankets were torn, a wooden chair lay smashed against the wall, and scratches marked the floorboards as if the child had tried to grasp something, anything, as she was dragged toward the window. In the snow beneath that window, the patrol found those now familiar tracks, and something new. Tufts of coarse dark hair clung to the window frame, and a smell pervaded the area that witnesses described as sulfurous and animal, like a goat left too long unbathed, mixed with something burning. The village erupted. Every able-bodied man took up whatever weapons they possessed and formed into search parties. They were no longer looking simply to find children. They were hunting the entity that had terrorized their community for 3 winters. The search extended far beyond previous efforts, reaching deep into the mountain wilderness that surrounded Berchtesgaden. For 2 days, they found nothing. Then, on the 3rd day, a party led by Magistrate Steiner himself discovered a series of caves in a remote area of the mountains, perhaps 3 hours' difficult climb from the village. The chronicle entry describing what they found in those caves remains one of the most disturbing documents in the Bavarian regional archives. The outer cave showed evidence of regular visitation. The walls were blackened by smoke from fires. Bones, both animal and disturbingly ambiguous in origin, lay scattered across the floor. Deeper into the cave system, the searchers found items that confirmed their worst fears. They discovered Margarete Hoffmann's winter dress, torn but recognizable by the distinctive blue fabric her mother had woven. Klaus Zimmermann's leather boots sat arranged almost ceremonially on a stone outcropping. The twins' matching scarves lay coiled together like sleeping snakes. Johann Schmidt's wooden toy horse, which his father had carved for him the previous Christmas, rested in a small alcove. Most heartbreaking was Sophia Brenner's prayer book, its pages swollen with moisture and cold, open to a psalm about deliverance from evil. But they found no bodies, no bones, no sign of what had ultimately become of the 7 children who had vanished across 3 terrible winters. The caves extended far back into the mountain, becoming narrow passages that even the bravest men feared to explore fully. Strange markings covered the deeper walls, symbols that resembled no writing system the villagers recognized. The smell that had pervaded Sophia's bedroom hung heavy in the air of the caves, that mixture of animal musk and burning that seemed to coat the lungs with every breath. Father Eckhart accompanied the search party and blessed the caves, but in his private journal, portions of which were later transcribed into the church records, he admitted his faith felt tested by what they had discovered. He wrote that the darkness in those caves seemed to possess weight and presence, that he felt watched by malevolent intelligence, and that the prayers felt hollow in his mouth as if the words themselves were being swallowed by something vast and hungry that dwelled in the mountain's heart. The village sealed the caves with rubble and stones, though everyone knew such barriers meant nothing to whatever had dwelled there. The disappearances stopped after that winter. Whether the discovery of its lair frightened the creature away, whether it had simply moved to hunting grounds elsewhere, or whether it had accomplished whatever dark purpose drove it, remains unknown. The patrols continued for 5 more years before finally being discontinued, and Berchtesgaden slowly returned to uneasy normalcy. But the legend changed. Krampus was no longer a story to frighten children into good behavior. In Bavaria, particularly in the villages near Berchtesgaden, the demon became real. The folklore transformed from cautionary tale to historical fact, documented in church records and magistrate chronicles, witnessed by dozens of reliable villagers, and marked by the empty places at 7 family table. Parents who told the story no longer did so with winking exaggeration but with genuine fear in their voices. The creature in the caves, the demon in furs with its chains and bells and basket for stolen children, had crossed the boundary between myth and memory, between legend and lived experience. In the bitter winter of 1527, in the Alpine village of Lienz, the church decided fear needed a face. The Holy Roman Inquisition had struggled for years to maintain absolute control over scattered mountain communities, where old beliefs died hard and Christian doctrine competed with pagan traditions that predated Rome itself. But that December, Cardinal Matthias von Schoenberg authorized an experiment in terror that would transform an ancient folklore figure into an instrument of religious domination. The Krampus, once a harmless seasonal bogeyman used by parents to encourage good behavior, was about to become something far more sinister. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Inquisitors recognized that the mountain people already feared the Krampus, already told their children stories of the horned creature who came during the dark days before Christmas to punish the wicked. Why create new monsters when one already existed in their collective nightmares? The church would simply claim ownership of this demon, transform it from folklore into theological reality, and deploy it as a weapon against anyone who questioned papal authority. Brother Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican friar assigned to the Tyrolean region, kept meticulous records of the first organized Krampus runs, and his journals survive in the Vatican archives to this day. He wrote with disturbing enthusiasm about the construction of the costumes, the careful selection of participants, and the psychological impact on village populations. These were not simple performances. They were calculated acts of terror designed to make abstract theological concepts viscerally real. The costumes themselves were masterworks of nightmarish design. Church artisans spent months creating demon suits from goatskins, horsehair, and carved wood. The masks featured real horns harvested from Alpine ibex, some measuring 3 feet long and sharpened to wicked points. The faces were painted with blood and soot, given expressions of rage that seemed almost alive in flickering torchlight. But it was the accessories that revealed the true purpose of these creatures. Each performer carried tools that blurred the line between theatrical prop and actual implement of torture. The chains were real iron, heavy enough to leave bruises, loud enough to announce the demon's approach from streets away. Inquisitors insisted on authentic weight and sound. They wanted people to feel the ground shake, to hear the metallic scraping echo off stone walls, to experience genuine dread at the approach of something that sounded utterly inhuman. These chains were not merely worn, but weaponized. Performers were instructed to drag them across cobblestones, to swing them menacingly at crowds, to wrap them around the wrists of designated targets. The birch switches formed bundles called rutin, bound together until they resembled crude clubs more than simple branches. Church records indicate these bundles often concealed willow rods or even thin metal strips at their core, ensuring that strikes would leave lasting marks. The official explanation claimed these beatings were symbolic, meant to represent the spiritual correction of sin. But witnesses described flesh torn open, backs striped with bleeding welts, victims left unable to work for weeks following their public correction. Most disturbing was the basket, the wicker cage carried on the demon's back. In traditional folklore, Krampus supposedly used this to carry away naughty children to his lair. The Inquisition version was built to human scale, large enough to actually contain a person, with a door that locked from outside. During the runs, these baskets were not empty props. They were filled with accused heretics, suspected witches, or anyone the local priest had deemed spiritually dangerous. Brother Heinrich's journals described the selection process with chilling bureaucratic detachment. Weeks before each run, inquisitors would compile lists of targets. These included people who missed mass, those who made suspicious hand gestures, women who lived alone, healers who used herbs, and anyone reported by neighbors for unclear spiritual offenses. The beauty of the system was its flexibility. Since everyone had committed some sin, anyone could theoretically be chosen. The randomness amplified the fear. On the night of December 5, 1527, the first weaponized Krampus run began in Lyons just after sunset. Church bells rang a discordant pattern, a signal for families to bring their children to the square. Attendance was mandatory, enforced by armed guards positioned at every street entrance. As several hundred villagers huddled in the cold, torches were lit around the square's perimeter, creating a ring of firelight that made the surrounding darkness absolute. The demons emerged from the cathedral itself, a symbolic choice that left no doubt about their holy authorization. 6 men in full Krampus costume processed down the church steps while monks chanted Latin prayers. The psychological effect was precisely as intended. This was not folklore, not tradition, not theater. This was the church manifesting spiritual reality, proving that demons were real, and that only adherence to doctrine could provide protection. The performance began with what appeared to be simple intimidation. The Krampus figures moved through the crowd, examining children, sniffing at people, growling and snarling. Parents pulled their young ones close. Then the tone shifted. One performer stopped before a teenage boy named Jakob Weissmann, whose father had been accused of reading prohibited texts. The demons circled the boy, chains rattling, then struck him across the back with the birch bundle. The crack of wood on flesh echoed across the silent square. Jakob screamed. His father moved to intervene but was restrained by guards. The beating continued until the boy collapsed. Then the Krampus dragged him by his hair to the basket and forced him inside, slamming the wicker door shut. 3 more people were taken that night. A woman named Greta, who had been overheard questioning transubstantiation. An elderly man who still marked his doorway with pre-Christian symbols. A young couple rumored to have married without full church blessing. Each extraction was accompanied by violence. Each beating was public and prolonged. And with each strike, Brother Heinrich noted in his journal, he could see the fear deepening in the crowd's eyes. This was not pageantry. This was punishment, real and immediate, delivered by creatures that seemed neither fully human nor entirely costume. The victims were kept in the church basement for 3 days without food, then paraded through town in penitent robes before being released with warnings. But the physical and psychological damage was permanent. Jakob Weissmann never fully recovered use of his left arm. Greta developed a tremor that lasted the rest of her life, and the entire village understood the message with perfect clarity. Sin had consequences that were immediate, physical, and inescapable. The success of the Lyons run inspired imitations across the Alpine regions. By 1530, inquisitors had established Krampus programs in more than 40 towns throughout Austria, Bavaria, and northern Italy. Each followed the same basic template, but local variations emerged, some far more violent than church officials had initially intended. This was the unforeseen consequence of weaponizing fear. When you tell men they are portraying demons and give them permission to punish sinners, some will embrace that role with disturbing enthusiasm. In the village of Berchtesgaden in 1532, a run ended with the death of a 13-year-old girl named Anna Reichert. Contemporary accounts describe how one performer, a butcher named Karl, who had volunteered for the role, became increasingly aggressive throughout the evening. When Anna was designated for punishment, accused of vanity for wearing a colored ribbon in her hair, Karl beat her with such ferocity that the birch bundle broke. He then used his chains, striking her about the head and neck. She died 3 days later from her injuries. The church response was telling. Rather than prosecute Karl or acknowledge the brutality of the program, inquisitors declared that Anna's death was evidence of genuine demonic intervention. They claimed that the Krampus spirit had possessed Karl, using him as a vessel to punish Anna for sins beyond mere vanity. Her family was informed that her death was divine judgment, and that they should be grateful for the mercy shown in revealing her spiritual corruption before it could spread. Karl was quietly transferred to a monastery, where he lived comfortably until his death 20 years later. Similar incidents occurred with disturbing frequency. In Innsbruck in 1534, a man playing Krampus broke another performer's jaw during a dispute about costume assignment. The injury was explained as the result of demonic infighting, proof that real spiritual entities were involved in the runs. In Salzburg in 1536, A woman died after being confined in a basket for over 6 hours in freezing temperatures. The church ruled her death a manifestation of her sinful nature, claiming that the cold could not have killed a truly righteous person. The performers themselves often suffered. Multiple accounts describe men who became psychologically unstable after repeated participation in the runs. Some claimed they could hear voices urging them to greater violence. Others reported nightmares where they could not remove their costumes, where the demon face had fused with their own. At least 3 performers committed suicide, and church records note each case with the same dismissive explanation: possession by the very demons they had been portraying. By 1540, the Krampus runs had become such effective instruments of control that inquisitors expanded their use beyond simple spiritual intimidation. They became mechanisms for eliminating political rivals, silencing criticism, and consolidating power. Anyone could be designated for punishment if they threatened church interests. The beauty of the system was its plausible deniability. These were not executions or arrests. They were traditional celebrations, folk customs, community events that just happened to maintain perfect obedience through theatrical terror. The torture devices designed to resemble Krampus tools grew increasingly sophisticated. Craftsmen developed chains with interior spikes that would tear flesh during dragging. Baskets were built with floors that could be heated from below, cooking occupants slowly. Birch bundles concealed barbed wire or glass shards. Each innovation was justified as making the performance more authentic, more spiritually accurate, more effective at demonstrating the reality of demonic punishment. What made this campaign of terror particularly effective was its seasonal regularity. Every December, the fear returned. Every year, new lists were compiled, new targets selected, new examples made. The anticipation was itself a form of torture, as families spent months wondering if they would be chosen, scrutinizing their behavior for any action that might draw attention, reporting neighbors to deflect suspicion from themselves. The psychological impact extended beyond the run nights themselves. Parents used the threat constantly. Children grew up believing that genuine demons walked among them with church approval, that sin would be punished, not in some distant afterlife but immediately and publicly. The line between spiritual metaphor and physical reality dissolved completely. Krampus was not a story. He was an enforcer, sanctioned by God and deployed by priests. This weaponization of folklore represents one of history's most cynical manipulations of cultural tradition. The Inquisition took a figure that had existed for centuries as a relatively benign seasonal character and transformed it into an instrument of oppression so effective that its psychological legacy persists even now, centuries after the last church-sanctioned Krampus run dispersed into the Alpine night. The snow falls thick over Salzburg in the dead of winter, and when darkness settles over the Alpine valleys, something ancient stirs in the narrow streets. For centuries, on specific nights between late November and early January, the Perchtenlauf has transformed this picturesque Austrian town into a theater of controlled chaos, where masked figures embodying both beautiful and terrifying spirits charge through cobblestone lanes in wild procession. These are not mere carnival performers or folk dancers preserving quaint tradition. Those who participate and those who witness these events speak of something deeper, something that touches on the razor's edge between ritual and reality, between performance and genuine violence. The tradition stretches back to pre-Christian times, rooted in the belief that during the darkest months, when the boundary between worlds grows thin, supernatural beings walk among the living. The Perchtenlauf themselves are split into 2 forms. The Schönperchten, the beautiful Perchten, wear white robes and elaborate headdresses, representing light, fertility, and the promise of spring's return. But it is their counterparts who truly define these winter runs. The Siakperchten, the ugly Perchten, don carved wooden masks with grotesque features, twisted horns that can span 6 feet across, fur pelts that make them appear massive and inhuman, and they carry switches, chains, and cowbells that create a deafening cacophony as they move. Their purpose, according to tradition, is to drive away evil spirits and bad fortune, to cleanse the community through fear and chaos. But what happens when the cleansing becomes contamination? What occurs when the mask, meant to channel ancient forces, refuses to come off in the mind of the wearer. The evening of December 5th, 1842, remains a dark mark in Salzburg's historical records. The Perchtenlauf that year had drawn enormous crowds into the Getreidegasse, the narrow grain lane that cuts through the old town. Witnesses described the usual scene: torchlight flickering off snow-covered buildings, the sound of hundreds of bells approaching like an avalanche, then the figures themselves bursting into view, their movements wild and unpredictable. Among the spectators stood Margaretha Hofer, a 43-year-old seamstress, positioned near the stone archway that marked the lane's eastern entrance. Contemporary accounts from the Salzburger Zeitung describe what happened next with clinical precision that barely conceals the horror. As the Skjagperten rounded the corner, the formation broke. One of the larger figures, described as wearing a mask with ram's horns and bearing multiple cowbells across his back and chest, veered directly into the crowd. Margaretha attempted to step aside but slipped on ice that had formed beneath the fresh snow. She fell directly into the path of at least 7 more runners who could not or would not stop. The autopsy report, still preserved in city archives, detailed massive trauma consistent with being trampled by multiple individuals. What haunted investigators at the time was the testimony of witnesses who insisted that after the first runner struck Margaretha, the others seemed to deliberately target her fallen body, jumping and landing with both feet, as if the mask had transformed them into true animals, finishing wounded prey. No one was ever charged. The chaos of the event made identification impossible, and the community's elders argued that the tragedy was simply an unfortunate accident, an inherent risk of a tradition that had always contained an element of danger. But whispered stories suggested something different. Locals claimed that some of the runners, when confronted the next day, had no memory of the woman's death, no recollection of violence. They remembered only putting on the mask, the sound of the bells, and then a blank space where the run should have been. The 20th century brought electric lights to Salzburg's streets, but it did not bring safety to the Perchtenlauf. On January 6, 1923, during the final winter run of the season, an incident occurred that even the most rational observers struggled to explain. Josef Kaltenbrunner, a 31-year-old baker and veteran participant in the tradition, had run in the Perchtenlauf for 12 consecutive years without incident. Those who knew him described a gentleman, devoted to his family, known for his skill with bread and his kindness to children. That night, wearing a mask he had carved himself featuring the face of a boar with tusks of polished wood, Josef began the run as always. But within minutes, witnesses reported that his behavior changed dramatically. While other runners moved in the traditional patterns, weaving through streets and occasionally charging at spectators who got too close, Josef began systematically attacking people. The first victim was an elderly man who stood well back from the run's path. Josef broke formation, crossed 20 feet of open street, and struck the man across the face with his switch hard enough to fracture the man's cheekbone. Before anyone could intervene, he moved to a woman holding a child, tearing the infant from her arms and throwing the child into a snowbank. The baby survived unharmed, but Josef's rampage continued. He attacked 6 more people over the course of 11 minutes, using his fists, his switch, and at one point, removing his mask to use it as a weapon, the wooden tusks gouging flesh. It took 8 men to finally restrain him, and even then, witnesses described his strength as superhuman, his movements as those of something not entirely human. The trial that followed became a sensation. Josef himself claimed complete amnesia. He remembered entering the run, feeling the mask settle over his face, the weight of the bells on his back. Then nothing until he woke in a jail cell, his hands bloody and his mind blank. Psychiatrists examined him extensively. Some argued for epilepsy or a form of seizure disorder. Others suggested a psychotic break brought on by stress or underlying mental illness. But several doctors noted something peculiar in their reports. Josef showed no signs of mental disorder before or after the event. He was, by all measures, completely sane, except for those 11 minutes. The judge, clearly uncomfortable with the case's implications, sentenced Josef to 3 years in a psychiatric facility rather than prison. In his statement, the judge noted that he could not in good conscience convict a man for actions he genuinely could not remember and seemed fundamentally incapable of committing in any other context. The case might have been dismissed as an isolated incident, if not for what happened 80 years later. On December 5, 2003, Marcus Weber, a 26-year-old fitness instructor from Munich participating in Salzburg's Perchtenlauf as a guest runner, experienced what he and others would later describe as a complete dissociative episode while wearing the traditional mask. Modern video footage captured from multiple angles shows Marcus beginning the run normally, moving with the rehearsed patterns that participants practice for weeks. Then, approximately 7 minutes into the run, his body language changes. He begins moving erratically, turning on other runners, striking at them with his bells and fists. When fellow participants attempt to calm him, he attacks them with increasing violence. Security footage from a nearby cafe shows him cornering 3 teenage girls in an alcove, pressing them against the wall with his body while making guttural sounds that witnesses described as completely inhuman. When police finally subdued Marcus using pepper spray and physical force, removing his mask required several minutes because he fought to keep it on, screaming in what officers described as a language they could not identify. In custody, Marcus became calm almost immediately. His statement to police, later used in his defense, described the exact same phenomenon Josef had reported 80 years earlier. Memory of putting on the mask, then complete blackness, then awareness of being restrained with no understanding of what had occurred. Neurological examinations revealed no abnormalities. Psychological evaluations found him mentally sound. Blood tests showed no drugs or alcohol. Yet, video evidence clearly showed him committing assault. The court ultimately sentenced him to community service and mandatory counseling, with the judge noting for the record his deep discomfort with a case that defied logical explanation. These are not the only incidents, merely the best documented. Archives contain references to dozens of injuries, several deaths, and countless episodes of unexplained violence associated with the Perchtenlauf over the centuries. Modern organizers have implemented safety measures, barriers to separate runners from spectators, medical teams positioned throughout the route, agreements among participants about acceptable behavior. Yet even with these precautions, injuries continue. In 2017, a runner broke another participant's arm during the Salzburg event. In 2019, a spectator required 12 stitches after being struck by what witnesses described as a deliberate blow from a masked runner, who then disappeared into the crowd. Perhaps more disturbing than the documented violence are the testimonies of the runners themselves, those who participate year after year, despite, or perhaps because of what they experience. Stefan Moser has run in the Salzburg Perchtenlauf for 19 consecutive years. Sitting in his woodworking shop where he carves the traditional masks, he speaks carefully about the transformation that occurs when the mask settles over his face. The world changes, he explains. Sounds become both muted and amplified. The bells create a rhythm that matches his heartbeat, then seems to override it, forcing his heart to beat in time with the metal clanging against his body. His own thoughts become distant, as if he is listening to someone else's mind. And there is always, he says, a voice. Not words exactly, but impulses, urges. The desire to run faster, to strike out, to pursue anyone who shows fear. Most runners learn to control these urges, he insists. But the impulses never fully disappear, and he admits there are moments during every run where he cannot be entirely certain what he has done or not done. Anna Kirchner, one of the few women who run as skiakperten in modern times, describes the experience in even more unsettling terms. The mask, she says, is hungry. When she first puts it on, she feels herself diminishing, her personality compressing into a smaller and smaller space in her own skull, while something else expands to fill the void. She has learned to maintain a thread of awareness, to keep some essential part of herself present, but she has seen other runners lose that battle completely. They become, she says, whatever the mask wants them to be. And what the mask wants, she believes, is chaos and fear, and a return to something ancient that civilization has tried to bury, but never quite killed. Psychologists who have studied ritual performance and mask traditions offer frameworks for understanding these experiences. The concept of de-individuation suggests that anonymity and group participation can lead people to act in ways they never would as individuals. The mask removes personal accountability, lowering inhibitions and releasing aggressive impulses, normally kept in check by social consciousness. Others point to trance states induced by rhythmic movement, sound, and sensory overload. The combination of physical exertion, the weight and constriction of the costume, the deafening bells, the darkness broken by torch fire, all of these elements can alter consciousness, creating dissociative states where normal personality structures temporarily collapse. But these explanations, while intellectually satisfying, struggle to account for the consistent pattern of complete amnesia, the specific nature of the violence, and the testimony of participants who describe the experience not as a loss of control, but as a presence of something else. The masks themselves, carved from wood according to patterns handed down through generations, treated with smoke and oils, worn by dozens or hundreds of people over decades, perhaps accumulate something. Perhaps the repeated performance of aggression, the channeling of ancient roles and forgotten gods, leaves an imprint. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more disturbing, that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, humans carry within them a capacity for violence and chaos that requires very little prompting to emerge, and that traditions like the Perchtenlauf survive precisely because they offer a sanctioned opportunity to release what can never be fully suppressed. The Perchtenlauf continues in Salzburg and throughout the Alpine regions. Each winter, new runners carve or inherit masks, strap on bells, and join the wild procession through darkened streets. Spectators still line the routes, seeking thrills and tradition in equal measure. And sometimes, not every year but often enough to matter, someone gets hurt. Someone crosses a line. Someone claims they cannot remember. And the ancient question resurfaces: are we performing the roles of monsters, or are the masks simply showing us what we have always been? Atolungs. In the winter of 1973, a 7-year-old girl named Claudia Hartmann sat in a therapist's office in Munich, unable to speak above a whisper. Her parents had brought her after 3 weeks of silence, night terrors so severe she would vomit from fear, and a refusal to sleep in her own bedroom. What the psychologist eventually uncovered would become one of hundreds of documented cases, revealing a practice that had terrorized children across Germanic Europe for generations. The tradition had roots stretching back centuries, but its transformation into something far darker occurred in the 20th century, when the folkloric figure Krampus evolved from a public spectacle into a tool of private domestic terror. Parents throughout Austria, Bavaria, parts of Switzerland, and isolated regions of Germany began hiring men to embody this horned demon, not during festive parades or town square performances, but in the intimate darkness of their children's homes. The methodology was disturbingly systematic. Parents would contact these men, often through word of mouth or community networks, providing details about their child's specific misbehaviors. Some kept lists throughout the year, documenting every transgression, every moment of disobedience. The men who took these jobs ranged from neighbors seeking extra income to individuals who seemed to relish the work with unsettling enthusiasm. They would craft or rent elaborate costumes, complete with carved wooden masks featuring twisted horns, genuine animal fur that carried the smell of decay, chains that rattled with authentic weight, and bundles of birch switches that left real welts when struck against skin. The visits typically occurred on Krampusnacht, the 5th of December, but parents orchestrating private sessions could schedule them whenever they felt their children needed correction. The child would be sent to bed often earlier than usual, told to think about what they had done wrong. Then, as darkness settled fully over the house, the performance would begin. Testimonies from adults who survived these encounters describe hearing the chains first, dragging along the street outside, getting closer. The deliberate scrape of claws or hooves on the front steps. Their parents would feign surprise or fear, sometimes hiding, abandoning their children to face the creature alone. The door would open, and the Krampus figure would enter the home with theatrical menace, moving through rooms with predatory intent until reaching the child's bedroom. Heinrich Müller, now in his 60s, recorded his testimony for a psychological study conducted at the University of Vienna in 2008. His voice, even decades after the event, carried the tremor of unprocessed trauma. He described how the demon entered his room when he was 6 years old in 1968. The creature stood over his bed, breathing heavily, the mask's mouth carved in a permanent snarl just inches from his face. It spoke in a voice distorted and guttural, reciting his sins with impossible knowledge. How did it know about the toy he had broken? The lie he had told his teacher? This omniscience was, of course, provided by his parents, but to his child's mind, it confirmed the creature's supernatural nature, making escape or protection impossible. The methodology often escalated beyond verbal threats. Many children reported being dragged from their beds, stuffed partway into rough burlap sacks or woven baskets that smelled of earth and mold. Some were carried toward windows or doors, the Krampus figure explaining in graphic detail what awaited them in the underworld or the deep forest. The beatings with birch switches were real, leaving marks that would fade in days, but memories that would persist for lifetimes. Dr. Anna Steinberg, a child psychologist practicing in Salzburg during the 1970s and 80s, maintained detailed case files on 43 children who had experienced these ritualized home invasions. Her notes, now archived at the Institute for Family Studies in Vienna, reveal patterns of psychological damage that mirror those found in victims of violent crime. Children developed acute anxiety disorders, persistent nightmares that continued into adulthood, difficulty forming trusting relationships, and a profound sense of betrayal particularly focused on parental figure. One case file describes a 9-year-old boy who developed selective mutism after a particularly violent Krampus visit in 1979. The hired performer had not only threatened and beaten the child but had actually carried him outside in sub-freezing temperatures, telling him he was being taken to hell. The boy's screaming eventually caused neighbors to intervene, but the damage was complete. He did not speak to his parents again for 2 years, communicating only through written notes, and even decades later, struggled with trust and intimacy in personal relationships. The question that haunts these case studies is why parents believe this extreme form of discipline was necessary or beneficial. Historical context provides some framework. Post-war Germanic Europe carried deep anxieties about moral corruption and societal breakdown. Parents who had survived the chaos and deprivation of the 1940s and 50s often believed that strict, even harsh discipline was essential to raising children who would never repeat the mistakes of previous generations. The Krampus tradition offered a culturally sanctioned outlet for these fears, a way to literally embody consequences and make abstract morality terrifyingly concrete. But deeper psychological factors were also at play. Some parents had themselves endured similar treatment as children and perpetuated the cycle without questioning it, viewing their own survival as proof of the method's effectiveness. Others seemed to derive a displaced satisfaction from the ritual, outsourcing violence they might have felt compelled to commit themselves, maintaining plausible deniability while still ensuring their children experienced fear-based correction. Audio recordings from therapy sessions, conducted in the 1980s, reveal the lasting impact with heartbreaking clarity. In one recording, a woman in her 30s describes still checking her bedroom door multiple times each night, still feeling a surge of panic when she hears chains rattling, even when it is just a dog's leash on the street below her apartment. She describes the betrayal as worse than the fear, the realization that came only in adulthood that her parents had orchestrated her terror, had paid someone to traumatize her, had stood by listening to her scream for help that never came. Another testimony comes from a man named Josef Kramer, who spoke publicly about his experience in 2015. On Krampusnacht, in 1981, when he was 8 years old, a Krampus entered his home in a small Austrian village. The figure beat him with switches until his legs bled, stuffed him into a basket, and told him he would be drowned in the frozen river. His parents, he later learned, had paid the equivalent of 30 euros for this service. He described how every December still brings waves of anxiety, how he refused to have children of his own partially from fear that some buried impulse might lead him to continue the cycle. The practice, shockingly, did not end with the 20th century. Documentation from social services in rural Austria and Bavaria indicates that isolated cases continued well into the 1990s and even beyond. In 2004, authorities in a small Bavarian town investigated reports of a man offering Krampus home visits for hire, advertising through word of mouth in traditional communities where modern parenting approaches had not fully penetrated. The investigation revealed he had visited at least 12 homes over 3 years, terrorizing children as young as 4. Even today, whispered reports surface from isolated Alpine communities, where the practice supposedly continues in secrecy. though documentation is difficult to obtain. Parents who maintain these traditions have learned to hide them from authorities and outsiders, viewing government intervention as an attack on cultural heritage rather than protection of children's welfare. The long-term psychological impact, documented by researchers, reveals damage patterns consistent with other forms of childhood trauma. Survivors frequently report difficulty sleeping decades after the events, hypervigilance particularly during winter months, strained or severed relationships with parents, and a complex relationship with their cultural heritage. Many feel caught between honoring their ancestry and acknowledging the harm done in tradition's name. What makes this practice particularly insidious is the betrayal embedded in its structure. Unlike random violence or abuse from strangers, these orchestrated terrors came from within the family unit, arranged by the very people children depend upon for protection. The psychological term for this is institutional betrayal, and it creates wounds that simple time cannot heal. Children learn that their safe spaces could be violated, that their protectors might become persecutors, that home itself was not sanctuary. The Krampus home visits represent a disturbing intersection of cultural tradition, parental authority, and psychological abuse that flourished in the shadows of 20th century Germanic Europe. They reveal how easily fear-based control can be rationalized as cultural preservation, how trauma can be passed between generations wearing the mask of tradition, and how children's suffering can be rendered invisible when cloaked in folklore's familiar form. The early winter darkness settled over Bad Gastein at 4:30 in the afternoon on December 5, 1975. The Alpine town, nestled in the Austrian mountains, had prepared for its annual Krampuslauf with the same meticulous care it had shown for generations. 17 registered performers had their costumes inspected by festival organizers that morning. Each mask was catalogued, each performer photographed for the official records. The tourism board had been promoting the event for months, expecting over 2,000 visitors to fill the town square and witness the theatrical parade of demons that was supposed to celebrate tradition and bring families together for harmless, seasonal scares. But something went catastrophically wrong that night. Something that would leave 12 people hospitalized, shut down the festival for 3 years, and create a case file that Austrian authorities have never fully closed. The festival began normally enough. At 6 in the evening, the Krampus performers gathered at the northern end of the town square, their bells clanging in the crisp mountain air. Witnesses described the atmosphere as festive, families with children lining the cobblestone streets, vendors selling roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. The evening smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon. String lights illuminated the Baroque architecture that had made Bad Gastein famous among tourists seeking authentic Alpine charm. Local photographer Heinrich Vogel was documenting the event for the regional newspaper. He had covered the Krampuslauf for 8 consecutive years and knew the routine intimately. He positioned himself near the fountain in the square's center, ready to capture the moment when the Krampus figures would rush into the crowd for their traditional harassment of spectators. His photographs from that night would later become crucial evidence in an investigation that defied rational explanation. At approximately 6:23, the Krampus parade began. The performers moved through the crowd with practiced choreography, rattling their chains, swatting at children with bundles of birch branches. The crowd responded with the expected mixture of delighted screams and nervous laughter. But then witnesses noticed something that didn't fit the familiar pattern. Among the registered performers, each standing roughly between 5'8" and 6'2", a different figure had appeared. Maria Hoffman was standing with her 2 children near the pharmacy on the square's eastern side. She had attended the Krampuslauf since childhood and immediately recognized that something was wrong. In her testimony to police, given from her hospital bed 2 days later, she described a Krampus that towered over the others by at least a foot, perhaps more. Its movements were wrong, she insisted. The registered performers moved like athletes in heavy costumes, careful and somewhat clumsy. This thing moved with fluid precision, its joints bending in ways that seemed inconsistent with human anatomy. Her husband, Klaus Hoffmann, corroborated every detail. He was a veterinarian, trained in observation, and what he saw violated his understanding of how bodies move. The entity's legs bent backward at the knee joint when it crouched, he reported, like the hind legs of a goat, but far more pronounced than any costume could achieve. When it turned its head to look at the crowd, the neck rotated further than human vertebrae allow. Heinrich Vogel captured it in 3 photographs. The images show a figure that stands out starkly from the surrounding performers. Where the registered Krampus wore costumes of dyed sheepskin and carved wooden masks, this entity appeared to have a hide that was simultaneously matted and lustrous, catching the festival lights in a way that fabric and animal fur simply do not. The horns rose from its head in spiraling curves, and multiple photographic analysis experts have since confirmed they show none of the telltale signs of attached prosthetic. No straps, no seams, no separation between horn and skull. The face visible in Vogel's photographs still disturbs those who examine them. The registered performers wore masks that were obviously wooden, painted in traditional red and black patterns with fixed expressions. The face in these photographs appears organic, with what seems to be actual musculature beneath the skin. The mouth is partially open in one image, revealing what dental expert Dr. Franz Müller later described as dentition, inconsistent with human structure. The canines are too long, too curved, set in jaws that protrude forward in a way that theatrical makeup cannot achieve without obvious prosthetics. But the photographs only documented what happened next. The true horror began at 6:31. The entity moved suddenly with explosive speed that witnesses compared to a predator's strike. It seized a young man named Thomas Becker by the arm. Becker, 22 years old and a competitive skier in excellent physical condition, screamed. The sound was not theatrical fear. People who were there say they will never forget it. It was the sound of someone in genuine agony. When the entity released him seconds later, Becker collapsed. His jacket sleeve was shredded. His forearm bore lacerations that emergency room physicians later described as unlike anything they had encountered. The wounds were deep, parallel cuts that suggested claws rather than blades. But the spacing and depth were wrong. Dr. Elisabeth Kramer, who treated Becker at Bad Gastein Hospital, documented claw marks that penetrated through layers of winter clothing, dermis, and into the muscle tissue beneath. The pressure required would have been extraordinary. The precision suggested something designed for exactly this purpose. The entity moved through the crowd. Festival organizer Johann Steiner attempted to intervene, thinking this was a performer who had gone too far in their enthusiasm. He grabbed what he assumed was a costume. In his police statement, Steiner insisted he felt skin beneath fur, warm and moving with muscle, with a texture completely unlike fabric or leather. When the entity turned toward him, Steiner saw eyes that reflected the festival lights with a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer found in nocturnal animals but not in human. He stumbled backward and fell, fracturing his wrist. By now the crowd was scattering. Parents grabbed their children. The registered Krampus performers, realizing something terrible was happening, tried to remove their masks and distance themselves from the chaos. In the confusion, 3 more people were injured. Anna Weber sustained lacerations across her back when the entity brushed past her. The wounds required 47 stitches. A tourist from Germany named Peter Schiller suffered injuries to his shoulder that left permanent scarring. Local police arrived at 6:45. By then, the entity had vanished. Officers found the registered performers gathered near the church, all accounted for, all able to prove they were nowhere near the victims when the attacks occurred. The town square was emptying rapidly, a scene of overturned vendor carts and scattered belongings marking the panic. The investigation that followed was unprecedented for a small Austrian town. Police Inspector Karl Brunner treated it as an assault case, possibly involving an unregistered performer who had used the festival for cover. But the evidence refused to fit that theory. Forensic teams documented the scene throughout the following day. What they found challenged every conventional explanation. Samples of hair were collected from Anna Weber's torn coat and from the ground where witnesses reported the entity had crouched. The hair was sent to the University of Vienna for analysis. Dr. Helmut Werner, a zoologist specializing in alpine fauna, examined the samples personally. His report, which remains in police files, states unequivocally that the hair matched no known European species. The structure was similar to goat hair in some respects, but with unusual properties. The medulla pattern was irregular, and chemical analysis showed protein compositions that didn't align with any reference samples in their database. The claw marks presented even stranger puzzles. Forensic specialists created casts of the deepest lacerations on Thomas Becker's arm. The spacing suggested a hand with fingers longer than human proportion. The curvature of the claw penetration indicated tips that came to finer points than theatrical props could achieve while maintaining the strength to cut so deeply. An experiment was conducted using professional costume claws available in 1975. None could replicate the wounds, even when wielded with significant force. Most disturbing were the marks found on the cobblestones themselves. In 3 locations where witnesses reported the entity had crouched or changed direction, investigators found gouges in the stone. The cobblestones of Bad Gastein's town square are hard granite, installed in the 18th century. The gouges suggested claws capable of scoring rock with the entity's body weight behind them. Materials experts consulted by police confirmed that costume props of the era could not create such marks without metal implements, and even then, the pattern was inconsistent with human gait or hand placement. The festival was cancelled immediately. The town council met in emergency session on December 7th and voted unanimously to ban the Krampuslof indefinitely. The ban lasted 3 years, an unprecedented action for a tradition stretching back centuries. Tourism officials protested, but local residents were adamant. Something had violated the safety of their town, and they would not risk its return. In the weeks that followed, residents reported strange animal behavior. Dogs refused to enter the town square. Horses became agitated when led anywhere near the fountain where Heinrich Vogel had stood taking photographs. Wild deer, usually seen at the forest edge near town, disappeared from the area entirely. Local hunter Georg Pfeiffer noted in his journal that animal tracks avoided the town in patterns he had never observed in 40 years of tracking game through these mountains. The behavior persisted for nearly a month. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, animals began to return to their normal patterns. But older residents still remember the eerie silence of those weeks, the absence of birdsong in areas that should have been filled with the sounds of mountain wildlife. 50 years have passed since that December night. Most of the registered performers from 1975 have died, but 3 still live in or near Bad Gastein. All 3 agreed to interviews in recent years, and their accounts remain remarkably consistent with their original police statements. They describe the same towering figure, the same wrong movements, the same sense of genuine threat that cut through the theatrical atmosphere like a blade. Maria Hoffman is now 78 years old. She still lives in Bad Gastein and refuses to attend any Krampuslof celebration, even though the festival resumed in 1978 under strict regulations and police supervision. When asked about that night, her hands still shake. She insists that what she saw was not a person in a costume. It was something else, something that should not exist, but did. Her children, now in their 50s, remember their mother's terror and have never doubted her account. Thomas Becker moved away from Bad Gastein in 1977. The scars on his arm remain visible, raised tissue in 4 parallel lines. Medical examinations over the years have confirmed that the wounds healed normally, but that their origin remains medically unusual. No doctor has been able to provide a conventional explanation for injuries of that depth and precision, occurring through heavy winter clothing, without cutting the fabric in ways consistent with blades or scissors. Heinrich Vogel's photographs were examined by photographic experts from 3 universities. None found evidence of manipulation or double exposure. The images show what they show, a figure that does not match the registered performers, captured on film alongside them for comparison. The photographs were published once in a regional paranormal magazine in 1981, but were largely forgotten until researchers began investigating the case more thoroughly in the 2000s. The case file at Bad Gastein police station has never been closed. Inspector Brunner, who retired in 1992, gave one interview before his death in 2006. He stated plainly that in 38 years of police work, the 1975 Krampuslof incident remained the only case he could not explain. He had investigated assaults, hoaxes, and accidents. This fit none of those categories. The evidence suggested something he could not reconcile with his understanding of reality. Modern researchers have proposed various theories. Some suggest mass hysteria, though this fails to explain the physical injuries and forensic evidence. Others propose an elaborate hoax by an unknown performer using advanced costume technology. Though no such costume has ever been found, and no one has come forward to claim responsibility. The forensic evidence, particularly the hair samples and claw marks in stone, remains unexplained by conventional theories. What happened in Bad Gastein on December 5, 1975, stands as perhaps the most documented modern Krampus case. The combination of multiple credible witnesses, photographs, forensic evidence, and consistent testimony over 5 decades creates a body of evidence that resists easy dismissal. Something entered that festival. Something that moved wrong, looked wrong, and left injuries that required hospitalization and evidence that defied explanation. The town square in Bad Gastein looks peaceful now. The fountain where Heinrich Vogel stood still flows. The cobblestones have been repaired over the years, the gouges filled and smoothed. The Krampuslauf runs annually again, carefully regulated and monitored. But older residents still remember when something uninvited joined the parade, when the line between folklore and reality blurred in ways that left scars, both physical and psychological. They remember when the ancient legend walked among them, leaving evidence that 50 years of scrutiny has failed to explain away. Every December, something remarkable happens across Europe. Cities that once whispered about Krampus in fearful tones now host festivals that draw thousands of visitors. Munich, Salzburg, and Vienna turn their historic streets into stages for elaborate Krampus parades. American cities have joined the phenomenon, with Los Angeles, Portland, and New York hosting their own Krampusnacht celebrations. Social media overflows with selfies alongside horned figures, their terrifying masks reduced to backdrops for tourist photos. The ancient demon has been transformed into entertainment, commercialized into costume contests and themed cocktails. Yet beneath this festive veneer, something darker persists. The central mystery remains unanswered. In our rush to embrace Krampus as charming folklore, have we forgotten what those Alpine villagers were actually warning us about? Why do reports continue to emerge that cannot be explained by performance art or drunken imagination? The historical record reveals a disturbing pattern that modern celebration conveniently ignored. Consider the evidence that resists dismissal. In 2009, during a festival in the Austrian town of Gastein, 3 participants were hospitalized with injuries that medical staff described as inconsistent with the explanations provided. The victims claimed they were attacked by a Krampus figure who appeared between organized runs, wearing a costume unlike any registered with festival organizers. Security footage from that night shows a 7-minute gap precisely when the attacks occurred, despite cameras functioning normally before and after. The 3 men, previously healthy and skeptical of superstition, developed severe anxiety disorders requiring ongoing treatment. None have returned to their hometowns since that night. Similar incidents accumulate across the decades. In 1994, a young woman in Berchtesgaden reported being followed home after a Krampus celebration by a figure she initially assumed was a late performer. She locked herself inside, watching through her window as it circled her house until dawn, its movements inhuman and patient. When investigators examined her property the next morning, they found dozens of deep scratches around every window and door, made by something sharp enough to gouge the wood, but leaving no tool marks that matched any implement. The woman moved to Hamburg shortly after, refusing to discuss the incident except to say that what she saw that night was not a person in a costume. The psychological effects prove particularly compelling. Researchers studying festival participants have documented a phenomenon they struggle to explain. While most attendees report enjoying the theatrical scares, a small percentage develop what appears to be genuine trauma responses. These individuals describe encounters that differ fundamentally from the organized performances, marked by an overwhelming sense of malevolence they cannot rationally justify. Follow-up studies reveal these responses persist for years, unresponsive to typical treatments for anxiety or phobia. Several subjects independently describe the same detail: the feeling of being recognized, personally identified by something ancient and predatory. The historical disappearances form perhaps the most disturbing pattern. Parish records from Alpine communities document cases spanning centuries where individuals vanished on, or immediately after, Krampusnacht. Modern researchers initially dismissed these as coincidental, attributing losses to harsh winter conditions or unrelated crimes. However, the consistency proves troubling. In the village of St. Johann, Records show 23 unexplained disappearances between 1700 and 1900, all occurring within 3 days of December 5th. Attempts to find rational explanations falter against the specificity of the timing and the way community records consistently note these losses differently from other missing persons, marking them with particular symbols whose meaning has been lost. What makes these cases remarkable is not just their occurrence, but the collective silence surrounding them. In villages where Krampus traditions run deepest, elders maintain a strict code about certain incidents. When pressed, they acknowledge that specific events occurred, but insist some knowledge should not be shared. This is not the casual superstition of folklore enthusiasts, but something more deliberate and fearful. Anthropologists studying these communities note a clear distinction in how locals discuss Krampus. The public festivals, the tourist performances, these they embrace and explain. But ask about particular years, specific cases, and a wall descends. People who will happily describe centuries of tradition suddenly claim ignorance or change the subject with visible discomfort. In the village of Heiligenblut, a community of fewer than 1,000 residents maintains records in their church that outsiders are politely but firmly prevented from examining. Local historians acknowledge these documents exist, but insist they contain private matters unsuitable for academic study. Those who have glimpsed fragments describe accounts of Krampus encounters written by parish priests that differ dramatically from folklore descriptions, detailed testimonies that read more like exorcism reports than cultural observation. Modern investigation continues to uncover puzzling, physical evidence. In 2015, a research team studying traditional Krampus costumes and storage at a monastery near Innsbruck discovered something unexpected. Among historical masks and furs, several items were sealed in locked containers with warning labels in Latin dating to the 1800s. The warnings advised that these particular costumes should never be worn again, that they had been used in specific incidents and become somehow contaminated or dangerous. Chemical analysis revealed nothing unusual about the materials themselves, yet monastery records insisted on their isolation. When researchers asked permission to examine them more closely, the abbot refused, citing protocols he claimed predated his tenure by centuries. Perhaps most unsettling are the accounts from those who perform as Krampus in traditional settings. While most describe it as theatrical fun, a small number report experiences they struggle to articulate. Several veteran performers have independently described moments during runs when they felt they were no longer controlling their actions, when something else seemed to direct their movements. These men, often playing Krampus for decades, speak of specific locations or conditions where the performance feels different, where the line between costume and transformation becomes uncomfortably thin. Most eventually stop participating, though they refuse to provide details about what specifically drove them away. The observation that haunts modern investigators is this striking contrast. In major cities, Krampus has become a beloved spectacle, an edgy holiday tradition perfect for the Instagram age. Travel companies offer Krampus tour packages. Universities host academic conferences analyzing the folklore's cultural significance. The creature that once terrified children has been domesticated into marketable entertainment. Yet return to those remote Alpine valleys where the legend originated, and the atmosphere changes completely. These villages, some of which have celebrated Krampusnacht for 1,000 years or more, maintain practices that contradict the sanitized modern version. On the night of December 5th, despite hosting public festivities, locals still secure their homes with a thoroughness that seems excessive for mere tradition. Doors are locked and bolted. Windows are shuttered. Families gather inside and remain there until morning, declining to watch the public runs they helped organize. Ask them why, and the answers come carefully. They speak of respect for tradition, of maintaining proper customs. But watch their faces, listen to the edge in their voices, and another truth emerges. These people, living in the heart of Krampus country, surrounded by tourists treating the legend as harmless fun, have not been convinced by modernity that it is just folklore. They have seen too much, remember, too much, know too much. The festivals will continue to grow. The costumes will become more elaborate, the celebrations more popular. Krampus will spread further into mainstream culture, his image softening with each commercial adaptation. But in those original villages, in the houses of families who have maintained these traditions across countless generations, the old precautions persist. They still lock their doors on Krampusnacht, and no amount of rational explanation has persuaded them to stop. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.